Welcome to CAE Pilot Podcast, a podcast that brings together aviation professionals to discuss life as a pilot, training, and career advice. You can find us at cae.com/CAE Pilot-podcast or subscribe to our show on your audio podcasting platform of choice. You can also find our video podcast on our YouTube channel.
Welcome to the CAE Pilot Podcast. In the past couple of episodes, we've brought you dream pilot jobs, and today we're doing the same. I'm thrilled to welcome Maria Wiuff, who has been a barefoot pilot in the Maldives. Welcome to the podcast, Maria.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
First question, and you know I have to ask it. Maria, a barefoot pilot, is it really barefoot?
It's really barefoot. You wouldn't want to do it any other way.
Well, I saw the picture of you that you sent us, and let me tell you, it looked pretty phenomenal. You know, getting off the airplane, the beautiful, colorful aircraft, the blue water, out of this world. I think in terms of dream jobs, I think that, if it were me, is pretty high on the list.
It was a dream job, and it was a dream going there and flying.
Before we get into all the dreamy stuff, tell me something. How did you get into flying? We always ask people, like, what was the moment that you fell in love with aviation and decided that's what you were going to do?
I'm not really sure if I can remember, because since I was a little girl, like when I was, before I can even remember, I was out flying with my dad, who has a private pilot license. So he was always flying in his free time, and we went flying in small aircraft, Cessnas and Pipers and Chipmunks, and we would go anywhere on weekend vacations to small islands in Denmark, and just on short trips. But I fell in love with flying from before I can remember.
So this has been a common trend. I think that for people, it's either they looked up and they had this dream of flying, or it's in their blood. So it sounds for you, it's really in your blood. And
Absolutely.
When did you make the leap from my dream, I'm going to do this, and then pursue your training? How did that all come about?
For me, it was a long journey, because I always did this with my dad for fun. So I always thought of flying as being something you would do for fun in your spare time. So I never considered it as flying for money, work, like a job, like something you could do as a job. So I never considered it. So I went to high school. I did everything that I was supposed to do. But in the end, I never really knew what I really wanted to do. And then my dad asked me, and my mom asked me, but what do you really like? What do you really love? And what are you really passionate about? And I'm flying. Then why don't you try that for a living? And then I never thought I could. It was like a dream job, and I never thought it would be a job for me. It seemed so surreal. So, but then they encouraged me, my mom and my dad, and they supported me, and I did it. I tried it, but it took a couple of years after school for me to figure out and really get the courage to go for it. And then I finally did it. I did a test, 2-day test, just to see if I was even skilled enough to complete flight school training. And I passed that test, and then I knew, okay, I think I can do this. I want to do it.
So what was your first job after flight school?
Well, that's the funny part, because when I finished flight school, there was no flying jobs whatsoever. And I was willing to do anything. I was willing to fly for free. I was willing to do instructing, flying parachuters, and I was willing to do anything, but there was nothing out there. I finished flight school in 2009, and it was just bad timing. So I started working in a kindergarten. So I was taking care of kids, and then eventually I got the opportunity to work with flight planning and scheduling in a company that has these private jets. So I started out there. with a plan of eventually getting a job flying for them. But what I really wanted to do from the beginning of my flight training was going to the Maldives and flying there. But that was not an option at the time. But I worked on that. So while I was doing that, all the flight planning and flight scheduling, I booked a ticket there to the Maldives to go knock on their door.
Oh, so you were motivated.
Yeah, I was really motivated.
And
I knew if I wanted this, I really had to go for it.
And your perseverance paid off, because that's exactly where you ended up.
It was, but it was a long journey. It wasn't as easy as I remember it now, but it took a couple of years. Yeah.
Here you are. You head down to the Maldives, but isn't it a bit unusual for a Danish pilot to head down to the Maldives for a job?
Yeah, you would think, but actually, the seaplane company that I visited and that I knew of was started by a Dane. It was a couple of Danish investors who went to the Maldives back in the early 90s, and they went there and they found out that in this paradise people only traveled by boat, and they saw all these islands and all these atolls, and they figured that there must be an easier and more efficient way of bringing people back and forth. And then they came up with this idea of making a seaplane company. So it was actually Danes who started up the whole thing down there in the Maldives. So I knew a couple of Danish pilots who'd been there. And in my youth, I used to sail since I was a little girl. And so I always figured that sailing and flying, if I could combine these two things, that would just be the perfect world. So when I heard about seaplane flying, and then in the Maldives, and that there were Danes there, I just knew that was my dream job, and I had to go for it.
Okay, so when you got the news that you had gotten the job, what was your reaction?
I kept pinching my arm because I couldn't believe it. It'd been such a long journey. Both it was my first commercial flying job, and it was my dream job. So it was the best of both worlds, and I couldn't imagine it. It was crazy. It was. I think I called all my friends, and I was both scared and thrilled and excited, because now I had to pack all my bags and leave Denmark. I never lived abroad before, so everything was new.
I imagine, though, that the Maldives is a kind of place where, the pilots come from just about everywhere, and everybody's sort of in the same boat, and there's a little expat community that supports one another that becomes maybe a second family even.
There sure is, but I didn't really know of it. I went to visit 2 years before I got the job. So I knew I met Canadian pilots, Italian pilots, Danes. I'd met, a lot of European from different countries, pilots, and from the United States and Australia. People came from everywhere in the world. And that to me was just super exciting. So I knew that going there, I wouldn't be alone. There was at least an expat community, but there's also we also were part of the local life. We also got to be part of the Maldivian lifestyle, and I got a lot of good local friends as well. So it wasn't only expat community; it was a mix of the local society, and then the expat society.
Okay, so we haven't even stepped onto an airplane yet, and it sounds like a dream job. It sounds pretty perfect. But
it was.
But now tell us a little bit about flying. Your transition from a conventional airplane to a float airplane, flying in a more, I want to say rural, but it's not what I mean, in a less populated area, small islands. Give us a little bit of an idea of what that's like.
When I was flying seaplanes, I didn't really think about the differences because for me, that was flying. So I didn't think about the differences. But when I sat down and thought about it, there's actually quite a lot of things that's different from wheel planes and the regular airplanes that we know. So some of the first things is that we don't have brakes on a seaplane. It's we just sail around on the sea like a boat, and then we take off and land on a moving runway, and that's quite different as well. And taxiing around, there's no nose wheel steering. There's we can only taxi around by, well, since the Twin Otter that I was flying in the Maldives is a twin engine, you can taxi around by using differential power. So that's the way to do it, and reverse, of course. And then the other thing is that we don't pump our tires with the air. We pump the floats free from water because they keep taking in a lot of water. So that's another big difference. And another thing as well is that we don't fly IFR. We fly daylight only. So that's a huge difference as well. And we don't care much about QNH. And that's a huge difference because that was a big deal. When you learn and when you do your flight training, QNH it's a big deal, right? You never want to mess that up. In seaplane flying, we don't really care because we take off from the water and you look outside your window, that's where the water is, and then we set the QNH to match sea level.
Right.
So we always just zero it to sea level. And then when we land, we don't care about what the altimeter says. Only when we fly and we cruise along, we care about the altimeter setting, of course. But for takeoff and landing, you look outside the window and look at where the water is.
And
so there are a few differences, definitely.
And around, like, at what altitude do you typically fly then?
Well, depends, because the flights vary in length. So some flights we would only do 500 feet. And others longer flights, we would go up to 5,000, 6,000. Maybe a few times I went to 8,000 feet, but that was it. It got too cold in 8,000 feet. You don't want to freeze. You don't want to be freezing in the Maldives.
And what about how is the airspace controlled, like air traffic control in the Maldives?
20 nautical miles within Male, which is the capital of the Maldives. It's controlled airspace. And then outside that, up to a certain altitude, and I don't remember, but that's uncontrolled. So you just fly around and you give information about where you're heading and what altitude you're cruising and your estimates for the next waypoint or island that you're going to.
And where you're landing, is it controlled space in that, is it a set landing, a designated landing area? Like, how do you, when you're approaching, you have boats, you have snorkelers, parachutists, they have everything going on around you. That must be just such a challenge in terms of approach.
Yeah, it's definitely very different from what we know from flying to and from runways that are paved and that are the only option you have. In the Maldives, you have a lot of other options. It depends. Some resorts, you land in a lagoon, which is I'm gonna have a hard time describing a lagoon, but it's like it's a pool where you inside that you've got calm waters, and it's usually attached to the resort that you're going to. And inside that lagoon, you either have a fixed platform that's connected to a jetty, or you have a floating platform. And inside that lagoon, you can take whatever direction of landing that you want. So usually that will be into the wind or parallel to the swells. In a lagoon, the water is pretty protected, so you usually don't have that many swells, so you just land into the wind. Sometimes in a lagoon, you would have a lot of boats docked, so you would be limited to a direction of taking off and landing, so you'd have to take a crosswind or whatever. But it really depends on what resort that you're going to. Other times, you would have to be landing in open water, And that means definitely bigger waters in strong winds, and you would have to struggle with a strong current sometimes as well, and there are different considerations. And for landing, we would usually just go to the resort, and then we would overfly the area if we would have to be sure that there are no snorkelers, no divers or boats. But usually we had like a designated landing area in this lagoon, and there would never be snorkelers or divers in that area, specific area. They would have other places to go snorkeling and diving. And speedboats would never be an issue in that area. Yeah, it was designated to us for taking off and landing.
So you don't have more missed approaches than you would in a conventional airplane then?
No, definitely not. No. And you do have a really good view when you're approaching. And if something were to, say, a speedboat were suddenly to cross our path, we would just go around. But because the Maldives is flat, it's not a mountainous area, so you would always have a good missed approach path. So it was never really a big issue. No.
And tell us about a typical day flying in the Maldives. What did that look like?
It was busy. We were really busy. We would typically, my alarm would be set for 4:30 or 5 a.m. And then I would go take a dhoni, so either a boat or a bus that would take us to the company. So we'd be ready to check in 45 minutes prior to departure. So that would be the first flight at sunrise. So depending on the time of the year, around 6 o'clock. And then we would fly all day long until sunset. So that was usually 6 o'clock. So that was more or less 10 to 12 hours of working a day.
How many legs would you do in that time?
Oh, that also depended on how long legs you were doing. But I think the most I did in one day was, I think it was, if it wasn't 18, then maybe 20, something like that. It was crazy, like 18 legs or so a day.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That's, and what would the longest flight be?
1 hour. That was the longest.
Okay, so it's really tiny, short hops. Wow. And so here you are. You see the sunset. Like you have the best view out of your office window of just about anybody. I would imagine these, sunrises you're talking about at 6 a.m. on the water must have been phenomenal. But you're also going in and out of these amazing island resorts. Have you ever had a chance to stay in any of them?
We did. And we did a lot of times. We had to, because they had early departures out of the resorts. So in order to get the guests out of the resorts early in the morning, we would have to overnight there. And so boohoo, we had to do that hard part of the job to overnight in these luxurious resorts. No, it was amazing. It was really great. So we did 2 to 3 times a week, and that wasn't too bad at all.
Okay, so what are the downsides to this? Because so far I'm not hearing any. I'm hearing beautiful weather, watching out for snorkelers, great resorts. It sounds pretty cool. What would you say were, like, just make us feel better for sitting here on a rainy day in Canada? What were some of the disadvantages of being there?
Let me tell you, there's a lot of guys I've met while I was working there, and pilots I met on vacation there who were flying conventional airliners. They were saying, "Oh, I always dreamt about doing this for my retirement job," and I was like, "Yes, you could, but it's hard work. It's hard work. Part of the job is also not only to fly the aircraft. You fly in really high temperatures and the air is really humid. So constantly you're warm and you're working hard. So you're loading the aircraft with luggage as well. You're fueling the aircraft and you are briefing the passengers, and you are making sure that the passengers are all right as well. So it's a lot of physical work as well.
It sounds like more of a private pilot type of scenario than an airline pilot scenario, for sure.
I think you can compare it to that. Yeah.
And we were talking about your schedule before. you would fly 12 hours a day, but what about time off, things like that? What was that like?
When I worked there, it was 5 days a week. So 5 days I would fly as much as I could. Of course, flight time limitations taken into consideration, but as well. But 5 days and then 2 days off. And they were fixed, so we always knew which days we had off, so we could plan on that, and that was really nice. And then we had a schedule that was 3 months on and then 1 month off, and for that month I could go back to Denmark and do whatever I wanted. It was my off time, so that was the way I used to work when I worked there.
It sounds really great. Now you're in this exotic location, going in and out of all these great places. You ever fly any celebrities?
Yes, I did, and I can't tell you who.
Okay,
but I'm sure most people know who. These people were. Yeah,
were they what you expected?
They were. I don't know what I expected, but I didn't have any expectations because I didn't know until last minute. That's how it works with flying with famous people, I think. And they were just so sweet and so polite, and they acted really sweet, and they were a joy to have on board.
They use a silly alias.
No, not that I know of, because I didn't get to see the PAX list.
One of the particularities of the Twin Otter is that there's no cockpit door, right? So, passengers are right there with you. From their perspective, I think it's cool. I think whenever we're on an aircraft, and I was a flight attendant in a previous life, so I spent a lot of time in the flight deck. It's cool to see, and I think passengers really like it, and bring kids up when it was allowed and all that. What's it like doing your job with, your passengers right over your shoulder?
Well, I think that's part of the joy flying with passengers, is that you can see their reaction. And for most of the passengers we brought back and forth, it was their first time on the seaplane. So it was great to see their excitement about flying the seaplane. So that part I really liked. Of course, they also really wanted to take pictures outside in the cockpit and through the cockpit window, because the windows are much bigger, obviously. So people got to visit the cockpit, and that was fine while cruising. And sometimes people would also want to take pictures standing up while we're approaching and close to landing. But on board the Twin Otter, we also have a cabin crew, so they're really good at controlling the passengers. But I actually like the part of the open cockpit.
And when I was a flight attendant, we were mandated to bring kids to the flight deck. This was always obviously pre 9/11.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And we were allowed to use the jump seat for passengers as well for landing. So oftentimes, and you're right, the look on their face when they get to experience this is out of this world.
You want to share that. That's the cool part about flying, taking off and landing, right? Why don't you? I really enjoyed sharing that with all the passengers.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's so cool. Now, I asked you at the beginning, is it really barefoot? And you said it is. How do passengers react to that?
Super surprised. And I think a lot of them, some didn't notice, others were staring at us and pointing and is this for real? But I think they just thought I was part of the experience and laughed about it.
Well, your uniform is still pretty official, right?
Sort of, if you think that shorts are official, but
it's navy blue, white shirt, epaulettes. It's got that.
Yeah. Compared to the uniform that I wear now, I would still prefer the Maldivian one, but without a tie, we could button up a few buttons and shorts. It's definitely my preferred uniform.
Yeah, when I went from commercial aviation to the business aviation world, I was always surprised because there's some customers whose pilots fly in jeans and t-shirts. And there's something that it might make sense, but doesn't click because we all have a picture of how a pilot should be dressed. And often It's the hat and all of these things. Yeah. But when you get out of commercial aviation, it changes a little bit, which is fun to find out.
My uniform I don't mind wearing, but the tie I could really do without. That would be, nice too.
I suspect that after COVID and everybody wearing their sweats to go to work, the days of the tie may be numbered. I can't imagine ever putting on a tie again.
Right. Yeah, you might be right.
We were talking about landing before, but in terms of takeoff, you ever been delayed by, pods of dolphins or what's the code?
Waves, definitely. There was a limit to how big water we could land and take off in, obviously, because it would just get too rough with the saltwater spray, and we would never, with big waves, you would never be able to accelerate a seaplane into takeoff speed. So the waves could be a thing. Another thing was tides, high and low tides, and sometimes the tide would be too low for us to land. But of course we planned our schedule with that. Another challenges was in the Maldives. Most people think of the Maldives as sunshine and blue sky, and it just isn't always. It is most of the year, and most of the year it is blue skies and sunshine, but there's also the monsoon season that most people don't think of, and it is actually quite a lot of months that we do have rougher weather and more thunderstorms and rainy days. It wouldn't be, I'm from Denmark, and in Europe we have these gray, long, rainy days. It would never be like that. It would be isolated thunderstorms and sea bees coming in and out, and it would be possible to just wait. We would, if we were flying in, and let's say we'd landed at a resort and a thunderstorm or a sea bee was approaching, we would just wait a couple of minutes, and then it would have passed, and then we would take off, and then we would just fly around it. It was never a big thing.
And you were talking about only being able to fly during daylight. So what were the challenges around that? Which sounds like a stupid question, I know, like fly during the day and when it gets dark land. I got it. But it must have been you must have had some interesting scenarios where you're like, oh, we better get there soon.
There was a few times where we were like hoping that we would make it, and we could just, when we were at the last resort, we just had to face it and land and say, that's it, we're not going anywhere. And people would be, it only happened a few times, but sometimes things happen. And the way we fly in the Maldives is like a bus tour. We would stop at several resorts. So we would leave Male, the capital, and then we would go out, stop at one resort, stop at the next resort and another. And if delays happened, we would be delayed, obviously. And then at the end of the day, there would be no more sunshine, and right. We would have to stop at a resort.
And I'm sure passengers were like, oh, I'm not going to get to where I want to go. I've got to stay here.
Oh, bummer. Yeah.
You were once filmed for Just Planes. Yes. What was it like flying with a camera crew?
Well, that's a funny story, because Just Planes, they'd been in the Maldives for, I think, 5 or 6 days, running around trying to get on an airplane to do some filming, do recording of the flight. But it never happened, and they continuously got bumped off the flight because there were too many passengers and the load was too heavy. And then I bumped into to one of them, and I asked them, well, I know how to work a GoPro, so if I can help you out anyway, I could do some filming, and I coordinated, of course, with my captain Johan. And he was like, yeah, sure, let's help them out. And we installed the cameras and got the remote for it. And so we just turned it on before takeoff and switched it off just right after landing. So the film crew wasn't on board. And they specifically told me, we're not going to be filming the first officer, which I was at the time. And we're only going to be focusing on the captain. So I didn't really think about it. I was just like, yeah, this is another day on the office. And eventually, when the film was uploaded on YouTube, I saw that it was almost only me in the camera. So that was quite a surprise, a good surprise, I guess. In
so what you're saying is you were cameraman or camerawoman,
I
the start in your own show. That's fantastic.
And a pilot, just doing my job.
The three things all at once. That's talent.
Well, I don't know. I just did what I was supposed to do. So yeah.
What would you say is your most memorable? What's your best memory of flying in the Maldives?
Being barefoot, flying around, and good colleague, the white sand, the turquoise water, and just adventure. It was everything: the sun, the weather, and the fun flying.
So my crazy question is going to be this: why did you leave?
Why did I leave? Yeah, why did I leave? Well, a lot of the older guys, they kept telling me, remember, Maria, to get some other experience, because you'll just end up like us being stuck here. And I was like, what's the problem in that? I don't see any problems. But they kept telling me, get some IFR experience. Just make sure that you see something else than this. And I took their advice. So it wasn't easy to leave, and it wasn't an easy decision, but yeah, I moved on.
Well, especially given where you ended up. How do you go from the Maldives to Greenland, of all places, where people often think, Greenland is actually white. Like it seems like literally the polar opposite,
It is the complete opposite, and then again, they have a lot of things in common, the Maldives and Greenland. I like adventure, and Greenland is adventure too, and I like flying. I like the stick and rudder flying, and Greenland is so beautiful. It's amazing to fly around Greenland and watch everything from above. It's just beautiful. And it's a much, much, much bigger island than the Maldives. So we fly longer trips, and I get to train my IFR skills as well. And then we do fly, it's still turbo aircraft. So I get to do that still. It's the same. And then we take off and land at very short runways, and we do steep approaches. So a lot of things are still the same, just with now I've got wheels instead of floats. And
boots, I would imagine.
Yeah, and boots. And a Canada Goose.
And what was did you have a big adaptation period, or was it just par for the course?
It took a while. I struggled a lot in the beginning in the simulator, just not to being able to look outside the window, because that's all we learn in the Maldives is to look outside the window and use your reference outside the window. And here I had to all of a sudden get back on the instruments and just rely on that, and speed tapes and FMS and autopilot. I was not used to flying with an autopilot. I really preferred just flying hands-on, and that took a while for me to get used to that. Now I think I've found the perfect combination of the two. I'm not relying or I'm not flying 100% on autopilot. I do a combination of so I get the best of both worlds, I guess. A little bit of autopilot and still a lot of hands-on flying.
And what type of aircraft do you fly now?
Dash 8.
Dash 8. Oh.
Yeah. 200s. Yeah.
I spent a lot of time on those airplanes.
Yeah.
So what's next for you? I mean, you seem like a very adventurous person. So, you've done is there a middle ground somewhere? What's on the horizon?
I still now tried I really like the turboprops, right? But I feel like I should go and fly some jets. So maybe in the future I would pursue that. And I feel like I have to try it, right? And I think that would be just as cool as an adventure, just in a completely different way, of course. But I do still miss the seaplane flying. I would consider going back someday when the world gets normal again.
Well, we're all looking forward to that.
Yeah.
Definitely. It's not. It's a crazy time. There's no question. And speaking of the crazy time, you told us a little bit about your story about, you didn't have a direct route into your first flying job. And right now, obviously, the pandemic has a lot of pilots either looking for their next job, or we have, people in our flight schools right now who are thinking, do I continue with this? Is it the right time? What words of encouragement would you have for people who are in that situation right now?
Well, I should know because I finished flight school at a similar time. There was no flying jobs out there, so all I can advise people to do is just keep your license current, keep flying, keep looking for the jobs, never give up, and go knock on doors. What I did when I wanted the job in the Maldives, everybody was telling me, no, there's no way you're going to get there, and they only look for experienced seaplane pilots. And I heard that, but I kept believing that I had a chance. And so I traveled there, I bought a plane ticket, and I went there and I knocked on their door and said, hello, here I am, I'm Maria. And I think you want to hire me. I really want to fly your seaplanes, something like that. Not exactly, but something like that. And I can really recommend doing that and not giving up, and look for anything. Look for any kind of flying. Look for flight training. That's, if you can get an instructor job, that's a really good thing to do. Fly small planes. That really is not a bad thing. That really just it gives you better flying skills and gives you more hours in your logbook. So anything you can do, or do as I did, to do something that's close to flying, and do flight planning, do flight scheduling, or work on a dock. In a lot of seaplane companies, they have dock handlers as well, and they load the aircrafts, they fuel the aircrafts, so you could get a job doing that, and you get closer to it, and you get to know the right people, and that's a really good way of getting your first job.
And I think that many people have told us, try and stay in the industry. You never know who you're going to meet, that your next job is through them. That's
right, yeah.
Maria, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. I think that you've certainly inspired me. I need to get to the Maldives, if nothing else. I think we'll have to wait a little longer for that, I'm afraid. But listen, it was really great to have you. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you for having me.
And I'd just like to tell everyone, please go to airside.aero. Lots of great resources for pilots. There's a jobs board. There's the CV builder, lots of great articles to keep you in shape while you're waiting for your next job in the air. Thanks again, Maria.
Thank you.
Take care.
CAE Pilot Podcast is brought to you by CAE, the global leader in training for the civil aviation, defense and security, and healthcare markets. For more information, check out cae.com.